Whenever we see a missing person story, our mind almost always reaches for the same two explanations. Something terrible happened to them, or they left on their own, but something different happened to this family in 1992. All three of them simply disappeared without a single trace. This is the case of the SpringField Three. Springfield, 1992. Sherrill Levitt was a hairdresser. She had one daughter who was still in high school. That daughter's name was Suzanne, though almost everyone called her Suzie. Suzie had a close friend named Stacy McCall. Suzie and Stacy were the kind of friends who moved through the same parties, the same late-night drives, the same plans for the future. They had decided years earlier that they wanted to graduate together, and they did. Sherrill was a single mother who worked at a local salon. She was close with her daughter in the quiet, everyday way that does not usually make headlines. Suzie attended a nearby school called Kickapoo High School. Kickapoo High School was one of Springfield's most respected public schools. Located on the city's growing south side, it was known for strong academics, athletics, and a largely middle to upper middle class student body. Attending Kickapoo often meant growing up in one of Springfield's safer and more prosperous suburban communities. On June 6, 1992, Suzie and Stacy both graduated from Kickapoo High School. Sherrill attended the ceremony. The two friends walked across the stage the same afternoon, exactly as they had planned. That evening, they began moving between graduation parties across the city. Nothing about the night felt unusual. They were young. They had just finished school, and the summer stretched out in front of them with no particular urgency. At some point after midnight, the plans shifted. A friend's house had become too crowded. Suzie and Stacy decided almost casually that they would spend the rest of the night at Suzie's house instead. The house sat at 1717 East Delmar Street. Sherrill lived there with her daughter. It was a small, ordinary place on a quiet residential street. They were last seen leaving a party around 2:15 in the morning. Both young women drove their own cars. The short distance between the party and the house on Delmar should have taken only a few minutes. Sherrill herself had been home earlier that night. Around 11:15, she had spoken on the phone with a friend while painting a chest of drawers. After that call, the record of her evening simply stops. The three of them were expected to leave the next morning for a day at a water park in Branson. Friends already knew the plan. Someone would call, someone would knock on the door, someone would expect to see them. No one did. When friends and family began arriving later on the afternoon of June 7th, the front door was unlocked. The cars were still in the driveway, three of them, Sherrill's, Suzie's, Stacy's. Inside the house, almost everything looked undisturbed. Purses were still there. Keys were still there. Money was still there. A small Yorkshire Terrier named Cinnamon was still inside the house, waiting. A television in one of the bedrooms was left on. An open pack of cigarettes sat near an untouched can of soda. The bed in Sherrill's room appeared to have been slept in. There was only one clear mark that something had gone wrong. The glass globe of the porch light had been broken. Friends who arrived first swept up the pieces, thinking they were being helpful, before anyone thought to call the police. An answering machine message that might have contained a clue was later erased by accident. No forced entry was found, no blood, no obvious signs of a struggle, no note, no clothing missing in any noticeable way. Just three people who were no longer in the house they had entered only hours earlier. Police were notified that evening. Within days, the FBI had joined the investigation. Search parties began moving through the surrounding countryside. Dogs were brought in. Aerial searches were conducted. The faces of the three women appeared on local news and then on national programs. Tips began arriving almost immediately. Over the years, the total would climb past 5,000. Investigators worked with a short window. The women were last seen around 2:15 a.m. By mid-morning on June 7th, the house was already empty. Whatever happened had taken place inside those few hours of darkness. Early theories formed quickly. Perhaps Sherrill had been the intended target. She was the only one expected to be home that night. Perhaps Suzie had been the target. She moved in social circles that sometimes brushed against trouble. Or perhaps the crime was random, someone who simply found an unlocked door in the early morning and took whatever opportunity presented itself. An FBI profile suggested the person responsible most likely acted alone, and that a larger vehicle would have been needed to remove 3 people at once. None of the early theories produced the kind of evidence that could close the case. In the months and years that followed, several names rose into public view. One of the most persistent belonged to a man named Robert Craig Cox. Cox had a documented history of violence. He had been living in the Springfield area around the time the women disappeared. Years later, while imprisoned in Texas on other charges, he told a reporter that he knew the women had been murdered and that their bodies would never be found. Investigators examined the claim. They have never considered it credible. Other names appeared and were investigated. Some had personal connections to one or more of the women. Some did not. None of them produced physical evidence, a confession that held up under scrutiny, or a location that yielded remains. Searches continued for years. Wooded areas, rural properties, places that had already been examined once and were examined again. Nothing definitive was ever recovered. The house on Delmar Street eventually changed hands. The street itself continued its ordinary life. New families moved into the neighborhood. The missing person posters faded and were replaced and then faded again. Parents of the missing women grew older. Some of them died without ever learning what happened to their daughter or granddaughter. Friends who had planned to spend the day at the water park with Suzie and Stacy carried the same unanswered questions into middle age. More than 3 decades have now passed. Sherrill Levitt would be in her 80s. Suzie Streeter and Stacy McCall would be in their early 50s. The file remains open. Tips still arrive, though far less frequently than they once did. What remains is a short list of facts that have never been successfully explained. 3 women entered a house in the early hours of June 7, 1992. Their car stayed, their purses stayed, their money stayed, their dog stayed, the television stayed on. The porch light was broken, and the 3 of them were gone. No reliable witness has ever come forward who saw them leave. No confirmed sighting has ever been verified. No remains have ever been identified. The case sits in that rare category of disappearances, where the absence itself is the strongest evidence. Everything that should have been left behind if someone simply walked away was still there. Everything that should have been disturbed if violence occurred inside the house was largely undisturbed. The ordinary details refused to resolve into a clear picture. Kickapoo High School continued graduating new classes. The salon where Sherrill worked eventually closed or changed hands. The water park in Branson kept operating through the summers. And the house on East Delmar Street remained a quiet address on a quiet street, carrying a silence that has never been broken. If the 3 of them left under their own will, they left behind every practical means of continuing a life. Money, keys, vehicles, medication, clothing, identification. If something was done to them, it was done with a precision that left almost no physical trace for investigators to follow. Either explanation requires a series of actions that have never been accounted for. The investigation has processed thousands of leads. It has looked at local men with criminal histories. It has looked at people connected to the women's social circles. It has looked at the possibility of a stranger who simply chose that house on that night. None of those paths has led to an arrest or recovery. What the public is left with is the same small collection of certainties that existed in the first days of the investigation. From time to time, a new tip surfaces. Most are examined and set aside. A few are followed farther. None has yet produced the kind of breakthrough that closes the file. The passage of time has done what time always does. Memories soften. Witnesses age. Physical evidence that might once have existed continues to degrade or disappear. Yet the core of the case has remained strangely stable. The same unanswered questions that confronted investigators in June of 1992 still confront anyone who looks at the file today. What happened inside that house between roughly 2:15 a.m. and the middle of the following morning? How did 3 people leave without taking the things they would have needed? Why was the porch light broken and almost nothing else disturbed? Where did they go, or where were they taken? The answers, if they still exist, exist somewhere outside the public record. They exist in a place no search has yet reached, or in a memory someone has chosen not to share. Now, that contrast is what keeps the case from settling into any simple category. It is neither a clear case of people who walked away, nor a clear case of violence that left a crime scene behind. It is something narrower and more difficult to name. 3 people, 1 house, a few hours of darkness, and more than 30 years of unanswered questions. The file remains open.